The town of San Jude sat on the edge of the Texas panhandle like a rusted relic forgotten by time, a place where the horizon was a flat, unforgiving line and the wind carried the persistent, gritty scent of dry earth and diesel. Chief Silas Thorne stood at the perimeter of Miller's Park, his boots sinking slightly into the sun-baked dirt. His eyes were fixed on a solitary red sneaker, lying on its side near a rusted swing set that creaked rhythmically in the wind. Scree, cur, scree. It was a mocking sound, a metronome for a tragedy. The shoe belonged to 8-year-old Leo Miller, the third child to vanish in 6 months, and the third time Silas felt the crushing weight of his own inadequacy. Silas was a man constructed of sharp angles and deep-set wrinkles. A veteran of the Austin PD who had retreated to the perceived quiet of his childhood home only to find a different kind of violence, one that didn't scream, but whispered. The air was thick, heavy with the electric charge of an oncoming supercell, but the silence in the park was what truly chilled him. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the silence of a held breath. No sirens blared. The town had grown weary of false alarms and broken promises, retreating behind deadbolts and plywood. He knelt, his joints popping like dry kindling, and leaned in close to the ground. He wasn't looking for footprints. The West Texas wind was too efficient an eraser for that. He was looking for anomalies. He found one. A small, jagged piece of clear plastic caught in the prickly pear cactus near the fence. It looked like a shard from a heavy-duty taillight. But it was too clean, too new. There were no skid marks, no signs of a struggle. It was as if Leo had been lured, not dragged. The boy was shy, terrified of strangers. Whoever took him hadn't used force. They had used a key Silas didn't yet possess. As he bagged the sneaker, Silas felt a prickle on the back of his neck. He looked up at the surrounding houses, small, weathered bungalows with peeling paint. Behind the lace curtains, he knew eyes were watching him. They didn't see a savior. They saw a failure in a tan uniform. A flash of movement in a window across the street caught his eye. A man pulling a curtain shut. It was the Miller house. The grief inside that home was a physical vacuum, sucking the life out of the street. Silas stood, his chest aching. He knew the clock wasn't just ticking. It was screaming. In cases like this, the first 48 hours were a gift. He was already at hour 36. And all he had was a shoe and a piece of plastic. The Lone Star Cafe was the heartbeat of San Jude, but today the pulse was erratic and thready. Silas pushed through the heavy oak door, the bell above ringing with a tinny, mocking tone that seemed to vibrate in his teeth. The smell of burnt grease and cheap tobacco really offered a strange comfort, but today it felt suffocating. He took his usual seat at the far end of the counter, a vantage point that allowed him to see both the kitchen and the front door. Martha, a woman whose face was a topographic map of Texas heartbreaks, slid a mug of black coffee toward him. She didn't ask how he was. She knew. They're saying it's the highwayman again. Silas, Martha whispered, leaning over the counter until he could smell the peppermint she chewed to hide the scent of cigarettes. My cousin, the one who works the night shift at the co-op. He saw a black van, no plates, lingering near the old grain silo at 3 in the morning. He said the driver didn't have a face, just a shadow under a brim. Silas stared into his coffee, the steam fogging his glasses. Martha, paranoia is a contagion. Last week it was a white truck. The week before, a silver sedan. People are staring into the dark so hard they're starting to see their own nightmares. But even as he spoke, he made a mental note. The grain silo was less than a mile from the Miller Park. He scanned the room. The usual suspects were there, old men clutching Social Security checks, truckers passing through, and the local labor. But his eyes snagged on a man in the corner booth. Elias, a seasonal harvester with nervous hands and a jagged scar running through his left eyebrow. Elias was tearing a paper napkin into tiny, precise strips. Every time the door opened, his shoulders hiked up to his ears. When Silas stood and began to walk toward him, Elias didn't look up, but his hands began to shake violently. Rough night, Elias, Silas asked, sliding into the opposite bench. I didn't do nothing, Chief. I was at the bunkhouse. 20 witnesses, Elias blurted out, his voice cracking. He hadn't been accused of anything yet. That was the tell. I didn't ask for an alibi. I asked how your night was, Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, predatory rumble. You look like a man who's seen a ghost. Or maybe someone who's worried a ghost is coming for him. Elias looked up then, and Silas saw true, unadulterated terror. You don't get it? This town, it's got veins. Things move through the pipes that you don't see. You're looking at the surface. Silas, you need to look at the shadows under the trucks. Before Silas could press further, Elias threw $5 on the table and bolted, leaving behind a pile of shredded paper that looked like fallen snow. Back at the station, a cramped, sweltering brick building that smelled of ancient floor wax and O's own Silas pinned Leo Miller's school portrait to the corkboard. The boy's smile was gap-toothed and innocent, a stark contrast to the grim faces of Sarah Jenkins and Toby Vance beside him. Silas began to weave a web of red string, but he wasn't connecting locations. He was connecting timestamps. He realized a chilling pattern. The disappearances happened exactly 21 days apart. It wasn't random. It was a schedule. He checked the calendar. If the pattern held, the collection, as his dark mind began to call it, was nearly complete. But why 3? Why these specific children? He began to map the logistics. He didn't look for where they vanished, but for the blind spots in the town's surveillance, the places where the few traffic cameras were broken or where the street lights had been shot out by bored teenagers. His deputy, Miller, a young man whose badge was still shiny and whose optimism was an irritant, burst in, dropping a heavy ledger on the desk. Chief, I did what you asked. I pulled the logs for the interstate toll booths 50 miles in either direction. It took some doing, but look at this. He pointed to a recurring entry. A freight company called Lone Star Logistics. They have a fleet of 20 trucks. Every time a kid goes missing, one of their rigs is logged passing through San Jude at an odd hour. But here's the kicker. None of their official routes require them to enter town limits. Silas traced the rail line that cut through the north side of town. It ran directly behind the Lone Star Logistics warehouse. They aren't just passing through, Miller. They're using the town as a pit stop. But Pendergast runs that place, Miller said, his voice dropping in disbelief. He's the one who donated the new jerseys for the Little League. He's practically a saint. Saints are just sinners who haven't been caught yet, Silas muttered. He grabbed the clear plastic shard from the evidence bag and held it up to the light. It wasn't from a truck. It was from a high-end, industrial-grade storage container seal. The kind used for transporting sensitive medical equipment or things that needed to stay ventilated but hidden. The tension in his chest tightened. He wasn't looking for a lone wolf. He was looking for an industry. The Lone Star Logistics warehouse was a sprawling corrugated metal beast on the edge of the industrial district. The heat shimmering off the roof created a mirage that made the building look like it was floating. Silas pulled his cruiser into the gravel lot, the crunch of stones sounding like breaking bones. Arthur Pendergast met him at the loading dock, wearing a crisp denim shirt and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Chief Thorne. To what do I owe the pleasure? I assume this is about the Miller boy. Tragic. My wife hasn't stopped praying since we heard, Pendergast said, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. Prayers are good, Arthur. Information is better, Silas replied, stepping out into the heat. He began to walk the perimeter of the loading bays, his eyes scanning the numbers on the trailers. I noticed your trucks have been taking the long way around lately, coming through San Jude instead of staying on the I-40. Pendergast didn't miss a beat. Road work, Silas. The state is tearing up the bypass. My drivers are on tight deadlines. Time is money, as they say. Silas stopped near a trailer with a peculiar cooling unit humming on its side. It was a high-tech model, far too expensive for hauling the surplus oil parts Pendergast claimed to move. Silas reached out and ran a finger along the rear bumper. He felt a slight indentation. He looked down and saw a faint, muddy smear the shape of a small hand, blurred as if someone had tried to wipe it away in a hurry. Something wrong? Pendergast asked, stepping closer. The air between them suddenly felt charged, the atmosphere of a standoff. Just admiring the maintenance, Silas said, his heart hammering. You keep a clean operation, Arthur. Almost a clean. No oil leaks, no trash. It's like nothing ever actually happens here. We pride ourselves on efficiency," Pendergast said, his voice dropping an octave. "But I'm a busy man, Chief. Unless you have a warrant, I have a shipment to move." As Silas drove away, he looked in the rearview mirror. Pendergast was standing on the dock, motionless, watching the cruiser until it disappeared into the dust. Silas knew he had pushed too hard, but he also knew he had found the hive. The question was, how many hornets were inside? The storm was finally breaking, the sky turning a bruised, sickly shade of green. Silas sat in the basement of the town library, the only place that still housed physical archives of regional newspapers from the last 20 years. He was chasing a ghost. He had a theory that Pendergast wasn't who he said he was. A man that polish doesn't just sprout from the Texas dirt. After hours of scrolling through microfiche, his eyes burning, he found it. A 15-year-old article from a small town in East Texas called Alara. 3 children had vanished over a single summer. The prime suspect had been a rising star in a local shipping company, Arthur Pendergast. The resemblance was undeniable. The same predatory jawline, the same cold, calculating eyes. Pendergast had vanished before the grand jury could indict him, and the case had gone cold, buried under a decade of dust. You changed your name, but you didn't change your appetite, Silas whispered to the empty room. He dug deeper, looking for Pendergast's associates. He found a name that made his blood run cold. Silas Thorne. No relation to Silas, but the same Elias he had seen in the diner. Elias had been a driver for Pendergast in Alara. He wasn't a witness. He was an accomplice who had been dragged along for the ride, likely kept quiet through a mixture of hush money and death threats. Silas realized the scope of the horror. This wasn't just a local kidnapping. It was a relocation project. Pendergast was using San Jude as a transit hub, a dark port where children were the cargo. The 21-day cycle wasn't just a whim, it was the time it took to secure a beer and clear a transport route. If Leo had been taken 2 days ago, the shipment was likely scheduled for tonight. Under the cover of the storm, Silas grabbed his coat and ran for the door, the thunder outside sounding like the footsteps of a giant. The rain didn't just fall. It hammered, a relentless deluge that turned the world into a gray, blurred nightmare. Silas sat in his darkened patrol car, positioned on a ridge overlooking Pendergast's private estate. The house was a fortress of stone and iron, tucked away in a valley where the cell signal died and the law was a foreign concept. Through his high-powered binoculars, he watched the silhouettes moving behind the frosted glass of the upper floor. Suddenly, the massive iron gates groaned open. A black SUV, the same one Martha's cousin had described, rolled out into the mud. Its headlights remained off, navigating by the flickers of lightning. Silas waited until it reached the end of the long driveway before easing off his brake. He drove with his own lights extinguished, relying on his knowledge of these backroads and the occasional flash of white light from the sky. The SUV didn't head for the warehouse or the interstate. It turned onto a narrow, crumbling access road that led toward the Desolation mine complex, a network of silver mines abandoned since the 1950s. The area was a death trap of sinkholes and unstable shafts. It was the perfect place to hide something you didn't want the world to find. As he followed, Silas felt a sense of impending doom. The road was beginning to wash out, the red clay turning into a slick, treacherous slurry. If he got stuck, he'd be a sitting duck. He saw the SUV's brake lights flare as it reached the mouth of a reinforced tunnel. Pendergast stepped out, draped in a heavy yellow slicker, looking like a reaper in the rain. He carried a heavy duffel bag and a long, thin case that could only hold a rifle. He wasn't just moving cargo. He was prepared to defend it. Silas reached for his radio, but the storm had turned the air into a wall of static. He was on his own. Silas entered the mine 5 minutes after Pendergast. The transition from the roaring rain to the oppressive silence of the earth was jarring. The air inside was cold, smelling of wet stone and ancient decay. He moved with a hunter's precision, his back pressed against the damp walls, his breathing shallow to avoid the clouds of dust The tunnel system was a labyrinth. He passed rusted ore carts and rotting timber supports that groaned under the weight of the mountain. He followed the faint, rhythmic thump-thump of a portable generator. As he moved deeper, he began to hear sounds that didn't belong in a mine. The soft, rhythmic sobbing of a child and the low, muffled sound of a television. He reached a wide cavern that had been converted into a grotesque living space. There were cots, crates of canned food, and a heavy iron cage welded from rebar. Inside the cage, he saw them, Leo, Sarah, and Toby. They were huddled together under a single moth-eaten blanket, their eyes wide and glassy with shock. Pendergast was there, standing at a makeshift desk, checking his watch. He was holding a satellite phone. "The pickup is at 0400, Pendergast said into the phone, his voice echoing off the walls. "The assets are prepped. Ensure the transit team is armed. We've had local interference." Silas felt a surge of rage that threatened to boil over. He checked his sidearm 6 rounds in the cylinder, to spare speed loaders. He was outnumbered and outgunned if Pendergast's transit team arrived, but he couldn't wait. The children looked frail, their spirits broken. He stepped out of the shadows, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom like a sword. "The only place you're transiting to, Arthur, is a cage of your own." Pendergast didn't flinch. He slowly set the phone down and turned, his face a mask of cold indifference. "I expected you earlier, Silas. You always were a bit slow on the uptake. Alara should have taught you that some things are too big to stop." "I wasn't in Alara, you bastard." Silas spat, his gun steady on Pendergast's heart. "But I'm here now. Step away from the cage. Or what? You'll shoot an unarmed man." Pendergast smiled, showing teeth that were too white, too perfect. He kicked a footstool aside, revealing a semi-automatic rifle leaning against the desk. "I'm not a common kidnapper, Silas. I'm a logistics expert. I provide a service to people who have everything except the one thing they desire: control over the next generation." "You're a monster who sells children," Silas countered, his finger tightening on the trigger. "I'm a businessman in a world that forgot the value of life," Pendergast retorted. He moved with a sudden, fluid speed, reaching for the rifle. Silas fired. The roar of the .357 Magnum was deafening in the confined space, a physical force that shook the dust from the ceiling. The bullet struck the metal desk, sending a spray of sparks into Pendergast's face. Pendergast dove behind a stack of crates, returning fire with a deafening burst from the rifle. The cavern erupted into a hellscape of noise and flying rock. Silas scrambled for cover behind a heavy ore cart, his shoulder screaming as a stray shard of stone sliced through his jacket. "Leo, get down. Stay flat," he yelled over the gunfire. The children were screaming now, a piercing, high-pitched sound that cut through the thunder of the guns. The mountain itself began to protest, a deep, tectonic groan vibrating through the floor. The structural integrity of the desolation mine, already compromised by decades of neglect and the night's torrential rain, finally reached its breaking point. A massive support beam, cracked and dry-rotted, snapped with the sound of a cannon shot. The ceiling above the center of the cavern began to sag, shedding tons of shale and dirt. "It's coming down," Silas roared. He fired 2 more shots to keep Pendergast pinned and then made a desperate dash for the cage. Pendergast was trying to retreat toward the back exit, but a second collapse blocked his path, a wall of boulders crashing down and pinning his lower body against the cavern floor. His scream of agony was raw and guttural, stripped of all his previous arrogance. Silas ignored him. He reached the cage, his hands fumbling with the heavy padlock. It wouldn't budge. He looked up and saw a crack spreading across the ceiling directly above the children. He took his revolver and fired 3 shots point-blank into the lock's mechanism. It shattered. He flung the door open. "Run. Toward the light. Don't look back." Silas ushered the children out. Leo grabbed Silas's hand, his small fingers trembling. "What about him?" Leo whispered, pointing toward Pendergast, who was struggling feebly as the dust began to bury him. Silas looked at the man who had stolen the peace of his town. Pendergast's eyes met his. There was no remorse there, only a desperate, animalistic plea for survival. Another tremor shook the earth. A massive slab of granite shifted above Pendergast's head. Go. Silas shoved the children toward the tunnel leading to the surface. He turned back for a split second, a crowbar in his hand, but the ceiling gave way in a final, thunderous roar. A wall of debris slammed down between them, cutting off Pendergast's screams and the sight of his broken body. Silas barely cleared the zone, the wind of the collapse knocking him off his feet. Silas crawled out of the mine's entrance just as the first gray light of dawn touched the horizon. He was covered in red dust and blood, his uniform torn to shreds, but he was breathing. Beside him, the 3 children sat in the mud, wrapped in his oversized police jacket. They were silent, watching the sun rise over the Texas Panhandle as if they were seeing the world for the first time. The sound of sirens finally drifted over the hills, a late but welcome symphony. Deputy Miller led the charge, a dozen state trooper vehicles trailing behind him. They found Silas sitting on the bumper of his wrecked cruiser, cradling a broken arm and watching the dust settle over the mine. The investigation that followed was the largest in Texas history. The Lone Star Logistics warehouse was dismantled brick by brick, revealing a network of hidden rooms and digital ledgers that implicated politicians, businessmen, and traffickers across 3 borders. Pendergast had been the linchpin, and with his death, the entire machine began to grind to a halt. A month later, San Jude was a different town. The fear hadn't vanished that kind of shadow leaves a stain, but the silence was no longer heavy. Miller's Park was full of children again. Silas stood at the fence, watching Leo Miller chase a soccer ball. The boy looked up and waved, a genuine smile finally returning to his face. Silas touched the brim of his hat. His shoulder still ached when it rained, and he still saw Pendergast's cold eyes in his dreams. But the highwayman was gone. He walked back to his cruiser, the bell of the Lone Star Cafe ringing in the distance. The town was still rested, and the wind was still gritty, but the air was finally clear enough to breathe. He put the car in gear and started his patrol. The dust had settled, but Silas Thorne was still on watch.